Viewers may remember last week I had on the wonderful Eugene Puryear, and we responded to a McCarthyite hit piece written by the New York Times that vilified Code Pink, Tricontinental, and the People's Forum, these anti-war organizations. They tried to link them to China. The problem with this piece, though, is that among many other problems, it talks about disinformation, but it doesn't actually lay out what the disinformation is. What do you think, Eugene?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. I mean, I think there's some allusions in there in different ways to Xinjiang. I think actually maybe talking about poverty alleviation and climate change. So, I mean, that's what it's basically come down to when we're talking about this issue of quote unquote disinformation, is the things actually don't even need to be untrue. They don't need to be, things that could be based in fact. They are just, in fact, the ultimate, just things that people and that the American government doesn't like. I mean, the whole goal is just like all these McCarthyite scare tactics, not to find any sort of facts, but just to, scare people around, actually saying what's right, and to consider collaboration with China to be some sort of crime, to consider arguing for peace to be some sort of crime. I mean, the whole thing is actually disgusting. And for the New York Times to put this out, I mean, talk about lavishly funded networks. I mean, that's one of the most lavishly funded corporations on earth, owned by an oligarchic family who's on the same company for, dozens and dozens of decades. So, is this a lavishly funded influence operation to push the views of the United States government? Because that's all they're doing in the article. But again, there's nothing in that article that's illegal. There's nothing in the article that proves any sort of connection between the Chinese government and any of the organizations that are listed in there. The tropes that are used are somewhat absurd, to be honest with you.
And we warned against how dangerous this was.
And, I think what we learned from the first McCarthyite situation, what we learned from the rise of fascism in Germany, is if you don't stand up right away, they will ultimately come for you. And if we don't stand up and push back, we're going to be in real trouble.
I hope the New York Times is proud of itself, because the New York Times inspired a radical truth teller. Marco Rubio wrote to Attorney General Merrick Garland and wants these organizations to be investigated. He writes, "I write to express my concern over certain far-left organizations that are reportedly tied to the Chinese Communist Party and operating with impunity in the United States. Combating Beijing's malign influence must be a key objective for the U.S. Department of Justice. Unfortunately, it appears the DOJ is either unaware or ambivalent to this growing threat. It appears," okay, Marco, just in terms of writing, you shouldn't say it appears so close to each other. You know what I'm saying? "It appears that organizations tied to Neville Roy Singham, a U.S. citizen, have been receiving direction from the CCP. Mr. Singham is the founder of ThoughtWorks, a Chicago-based software consultancy, and for many years promoted far-left causes. Mr. Singham reportedly created a dark money system that allows him to send funds to a number of far-left organizations." And then he says, according to the New York Times, reporters, quote, "tracked hundreds of millions of dollars to groups linked to Mr. Singham that mix progressive advocacy with Chinese government talking points," end quote. So the problem with this, of course, is that there are lots of things that places like the New York Times and, cretins like Marco Rubio would dismiss as Chinese government talking points. But there are also things that people just believe in.
Yeah.
And not because China finds them politically convenient. It's like what they did with Russiagate, when they were mad at Jill Stein was a Russian operative, or Abby Martin was a Russian operative, or spouting Russian talking points because she would talk about Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also like the hypocrisy of casting aspersions on dark money when none of these people support actual campaign finance reform,
of course,
actual transparency and donations, right? Because they've all got all these bundled donors and all these organizations and all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad the New York Times. I mean, it's almost refreshing. It's like we were saying that stuff like this was dangerous and will unleash persecution and a witch hunt, and sure enough, it does. And it did.
So ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a long script, and that labor radicalism, civil rights are always associated with these red scares. And the most radical people who want the best wages and the best working conditions for workers, who want the quickest and most substantive end to racism in America, who want basically the fairest possible society where everyone has the best possible chance to live and thrive the best they can, become the first victims of these kind of attacks. And that's exactly what's happening here. And it's you know, the New York Times, these liberals are just as complicit. I mean, you know, Trump is open about it. You know, he's making these crazy claims about communism and Marxism that are totally fake and totally scurrilous. And the Republicans are obviously on a hardcore McCarthyite witch hunt. But these liberals and the people in the New York Times, in a way, are just as bad, because they're trying to act like they actually care about progressive issues when you read the New York Times you know, editorial page. But at the end of the day, you know, they're also just as complicit with these sorts of politics that prevent that kind of you know, substantive change from coming to the country.
And it's just shameful that more people aren't speaking out about it. And it's shameful that people aren't up in arms about it.